Hi, in this video I'm going to compare the equalizer of my Heritage Audio 1073 clone hardware to the plugins of the UAD and Analog Obsession, which are also 1073 emulations. I will let you listen to the differences as well as show you the differences in a visual way. So let's go! So my history with 1073 style equalizers goes back quite a while and started when I started using the 1073 Legacy plugin on the UAD card. I think it was one of their very first emulations on the platform, so it goes back quite a while, and again a number of years ago already they also released an update of that, and that's the plugin I'm going to use for the comparison. Now on the hardware side I've always wanted to have a 1073 style preamp because it's really a legendary recording channel for a really lush and rich, thick sound. And I had been eyeing a very high-end module of Heritage Audio for quite a number of years already, when suddenly they came out with a more affordable version of a 1073 preamp, including the famous equalizer. So I basically jumped on that just after they released it, which is basically a few years ago already now. I mainly use it for recording, so not so much for mixing, but for this video I will just use the equalizer from the preamp via the line-in and test it against two plugins. Because another plugin that I recently heard very good things about is the Analog Obsession Britchannel, which is also a Neve 1073 style emulation, and the good thing about it is that it's free. So let's have a look at the websites of these products. So over here you can see the Heritage Audio website with the product page of the Heritage Audio 73 Equalizer Elite series. And they have them in three different variants: a mono channel with equalizer, a mono channel with just a preamp, and a stereo channel with two preamps. The one I have is the mono channel with equalizer. So it has all the options that are displayed here, but for this test we're just gonna use the middle four knobs being the equalizer. For the UAD card, this is the latest version of the 1073 emulation. This is a nice picture, and this is the plugin that they have. I think it's one of the first plugins that's based on the Unison technology. Unfortunately, that's only available when you have one of the Apollo interfaces, and that basically means that you can also emulate the preamp character of this device. But I don't have an Apollo, I just have the UAD cards in my PC, so we're just going to test the equalizer of this plugin as well. And the Analog Obsession plugin is something that I heard very recently about. I heard good things about it, so I figured I'd also make this part of this test. You can find them on Patreon, so it is actually donationware. There's a Brit bundle with a compressor, just a preamp, and the Brit channel with the equalizer. So what I'm going to use for this test is actually the Brit channel. And as you can see over here, you can freely download it for Mac and Windows. And it's donationware, so meaning that if you like these plugins and appreciate this effort, then you can become a Patreon of Analog Obsession so that you can keep working on making nice plugins. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to compare the hardware and both plugins on the same audio tracks. I'm going to set the hardware for a sound that I like, and then I'm going to try to match it with both plugins. So I'm going to start with the same settings on both plugins, but then I'm going to adjust the plugins to make them sound as similar to the hardware as I can. And I'm going to do that by listening, but also by using the EQ match in Pro Q3. In this video, I'm just going to show you the results of the EQ match after I've adjusted the plugins to sound like the hardware. But I have another video up here in which I actually show you how I set up Pro Q3 to do this EQ match. So if you're interested, have a look after you've watched this video, of course. So let's start by comparing the hardware and the plugins on the snare top track. Okay, so I have 4 tracks with a snare top, and the first track does not contain any EQ on its inserts. And the second track has the Heritage Audio 73 EQ on the insert as an external effect. So let's first have a listen to the difference with and without EQ. So the difference is pretty obvious, I would think. If you look at the picture here of how I've set the Heritage Audio EQ for this, it's actually a technique that I demonstrated in the mixing snare video, which I'll link up on top, by Andrew Sheps. You see that I have a low cut at 80 so that any low rumble gets removed. I'm boosting a bit of the meat of the snare at 220. I'm boosting the snap at 7.2K and I'm giving it some extra air with the high band. Now what I've basically done on the other tracks, for example on this one, I have the 1073 EQ. I've started by setting the controls in exactly the same way as I did on the Heritage Audio. And then I listened to the difference and I measured the difference and I've compensated for the difference. So I've tried to get them as close to each other as possible. And the same thing on the Analog Obsession Britchannel. Again, I started with the same settings and then I adjusted to make sure that they sounded the same. So let's have a listen to the differences with these three 1073 EQs. Okay, so what do you think? Can you hear the difference after I've tried to make them sound as equal as possible? Let me know in the comments what you can hear as a difference and what you prefer. And let's now have a look at how I've had to compensate on both plugins to make them sound like the hardware, and then how well the equalizers matched when I compared them with the Pro Q3 EQ match. So again, these are the settings which I did on the hardware, the Heritage Audio 73 EQ. And these are the settings that I did on the UAD plugin to make it sound as close as possible. And fact is that I almost didn't have to touch the plugin. So even with just the same settings, the sound and the EQ match already provided a result which was very, very close. The only thing that I really adjusted was the low shelf at 220. It was set to about +3 on the hardware, and I think I had to turn it down to +2.5 on the plugin. And then the EQ match provided the following result, which actually stays within 1 dB for most of the spectrum. Yeah, up high there's probably not enough information to be very accurate, and in the very low band there's also not a lot of information to be very accurate. There's just a slight +1 dB deviation between 80 Hz and around 200-300 Hz. But that's about it really, and I was actually surprised how close this came. Now if we then look at the other Analog Obsession EQ, this one I had to adjust a bit more. For example, on the high shelf I had to take it down by 1 notch, and on the 7.2K high shelf I had to really boost it much more. Obviously 1 click or dot on the hardware is not necessarily the same as 1 click or dot on the plugin, but still on the plugin I'm almost at half the range that I can go up, and on the hardware, well, I'm not that far at all. And on the plugin I also had to boost the 220 band a bit more than on the hardware. And that finally gave the following EQ match result. So still pretty flat, but there were a couple more bumps that I couldn't really compensate for. Especially in the low end here, this graph says that I would need to boost around 60-70 Hz, a bit more, to get the same frequency response as on the hardware. But obviously I can't do that because I just have my low cut filter there, which was set to the same value. So now let's have a look at a comparison on the vocal track. So what you're now looking at are 4 of the same vocal tracks. The first track has no EQ on it, and the second track has the Heritage Audio hardware insert on it. So let's first have a listen to the differences between the vocal without equalizer and with the hardware equalizer on it.
Storm is rising, the wind is crying, stars are falling down.
So I think these differences are obvious. If you look at my settings on the hardware, you can see that I've cut at 50 Hz again to get rid of the low rumble. The low shelf I've boosted a bit at 110 to add some warmth. On the mid-band I've cut some at 3.2K to get rid of some harshness. And the high shelf I've boosted again then to add some air to the vocal. And that's basically it. And if you now look at the other tracks, you can see that I've put similar settings on the UAD and then adjusted to match the hardware sound. And on the bridge channel I've done the same. I started with the same settings and then I adjusted to make it comparable to how the hardware sounds. So let's first have a listen and compare the hardware with the two plugins, again after I've done the compensation already to make them sound as similar as possible.
Storm is rising, the wind is crying, stars are falling down. Hope is rising, the world is trying to keep those stars in place. Put a smile back on your face.
So what do you think? Can you hear the difference? If you can, please put your remarks in the comments and tell me which one you prefer. And if you cannot, it may also be due to the audio compression that YouTube adds. And I've also provided these tracks for download in the description below, so you can have a listen in your own DAW. Now these vocal tracks that you're listening to are actually courtesy of Perfect Sounds Unleashed again. I've used them in other videos as well. So thanks again, Peter. I'll link your socials down below in the description. And they are the lead vocal tracks of a newer Suoss song that he's currently mixing in his studio. And they will be released April 2nd in 2021. So depending on when you're watching this video, the track may already have been released. So in that case, have a listen. But back to the regular program. So let's now have a look at how I've had to compensate on the plugins to match the hardware sound and what the final EQ match looks like then. So again, these were the settings on the hardware that I did on the equalizer. And these are the settings that I had to do on the Neve 1073 emulation to get the sound that was closest. And again, as on the snare example, I almost did not have to change anything on the UAD plugin. The only thing I had to do on the UAD plugin is to reduce the low band at 110 by about half a unit, half a dot, which is again very similar to what I had to do for the snare example. And that provided the following EQ match. So again, very flat, except for a slight bump that would still be necessary at around 50 Hz to make the plugin match the hardware. So the plugin has slightly less lows in this example. Now on the Analog Obsession plugin, the results are also quite similar to how I've had to compensate for the snare. And that is, I've had to boost the high shelf quite a lot to get the same amount of high end. The cut at 3.2K I've had to reduce a little bit. And the boost at 10 I had to really make that a lot more as well. And that gave the following result in the EQ match. Also still quite flat, but with a couple more bumps and dips here and there. So what do you think? Which one do you prefer in this case? Let me know in the description if you have an opinion about this. And if you can't yet hear a difference, you can also try downloading the tracks that I've provided in the description so you can have a listen in your own DAW without the YouTube compression. Now I have to say, for me, I've done a couple of these videos in which I compare hardware to plugins. And I think in this case, the results were the closest so far. I was especially surprised by the fact that the hardware and the UAD plugin matched so well, even without changing any of the settings almost on the UAD plugin. So apparently these manufacturers both agree on how a 1073 equalizer should sound. Now for the Analog Obsession plugin, it's a bit of an outsider of course, because it's not one of the big commercial parties here. So I've had to do quite some different settings to get a similar sound. But in the end, the sound was quite similar and quite close to me at least. And that for a plugin which is basically donationware, so you can download and try it for free and then you can donate whatever you want, which actually seems quite a good deal to me. Now with a comparison like this of hardware and plugins, there's a couple more reasons why they may not fully match. One of them is, for example, is that the hardware actually has an extra round trip to the converters. The plugins don't have this. And not every old 1073 unit may actually sound the same to another 1073 unit in the field either. So the modeling may have been done based on other units which already sounded dissimilar. So I'm just saying that this may also account for some of the differences that you may have heard or seen in this comparison. So if you're still here at this video at this point in time, you must have liked it or found it useful. So please help me out on YouTube by giving it a thumbs up, subscribing to the channel, and you can also ring the little bell icon so you get notified when I post another video. Now the next video on your top right here is a video in which I also compare hardware with plugins, but in there I will show you a bit more about how I exactly do the EQ match with Pro-Q. So have a look, enjoy, and see you soon.